Well, the fall of Bashar al Assad in Syria has put a sizable dent in the armor of alliances among dictators. Now, these are the autocrats who, as my next guest says, are united in their aim of derailing the rules-based international order as we know it. The Pulitzer Prize-winning author Anne Applebaum addresses that alliance in her latest book, Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. She examines how these authoritarian leaders help each other to undermine the liberal values that they see as a threat to their own existence. These are leaders united more so by deals, less so by ideals. I'm happy to welcome to the program tonight Anne Applebaum. Anne, it's good to have you with us. I have to start with what has been the biggest story all week, the end of the Assad regime in Syria. How do you read this? Is this a defeat for Autocracy, Inc., or did the autocrats simply manage to discard a weak link?
Syria was a really important project for both Russia and Iran, and it was probably the origin of their closer relationship, which we now see playing out in Ukraine, where the Iranians are helping the Russians to destroy Ukrainian cities. I think what's interesting, though, about Syria, as your question implies, is that it's also clearly a place where both Russia and Iran, for different reasons, were unable to continue helping keep their client state in power. The Russians, because of needing to send weapons and people back to Ukraine in order to fight it there, and the Iranians because of the losses suffered by Hezbollah, who was their main proxy in the region. So the system that existed before, which was that there was enough money and enough outside aid coming in that Bashar al Assad was able to stay in power, wasn't able to keep the system going anymore. People who worked for the regime began to fear that it was going to lose, and you saw what happened. They stopped fighting.
In your book, you reference what's termed a regime survival package offered by Russia, for example, to some African autocracies. Given the failure of Russia to bail out Assad, what is that Russian guarantee worth tonight?
It's a question that I hope a lot of people are asking themselves right now. There was a clear Russian guarantee to Assad. There are Russian bases still in Syria. We don't really know yet what their fate is. There's implied Russian help. There have been mercenaries. There has been military aid to a number of dictatorships in Africa, but also Russia has played a role in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Nicaragua, and elsewhere. And I do hope that the leaders of those countries begin to ask themselves whether this support for might not last. Russia has implied through its actions and through its alliances that it will be there forever, that its regime is forever, that it's longer lasting, that it's stronger, that it can outlast democracies that it implies are degenerate and divided. And I think this week's news shows that that's just not true.
Yeah, I mean, Assad fell despite the relative proximity of his backers, Iran and Russia. And if you push this out further, I'm wondering how secure do you think Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro is feeling tonight?
It's very interesting. I actually think there are a lot of parallels between the Syrian situation and the Venezuelan one, even of course, there are different parts of the world and they have nothing in common culturally or otherwise. But in Syria, you clearly had a military and a police force who lost faith in the regime and who didn't want to defend it anymore. When the rebels came into first Aleppo and then Damascus, they were actually, they weren't fighting. They just marched in. People deserted their posts. The Venezuelans, I know the Venezuelan regime is equally worried about their own army and their own security forces. And this is stepping back. This is a problem for all dictatorships. The security police and the army, these are part of the country too. And when you have a system of mass repression like in Syria or increasingly in Venezuela, people's cousins and friends and relatives and acquaintances are victims of the regime and they know it. And so the moment that they sense weakness, that the regime isn't going to protect them or stand by them or give them special privileges anymore, that's the moment when the systems begin to fall. And this is something that absolutely could happen in Venezuela very soon.
Can we talk, though, about a global network of autocrats helping each other? I mean, you said that they're united more in their deals, less so in their ideals. It sounds like you're describing fair weather friends here. Is that an accurate assessment?
I don't know that it's fair weather friends as much as these are regimes that are linked to one another opportunistically. So they aren't linked by some deep bonds of friendship or shared ideology. I mean, there is no shared ideology between Russia and Iran and Syria and Venezuela. But they're rather linked by a perception of common interest, whether it's common interest in the narcotics trade or common interest in disruption or common interest in maintaining themselves in power or common interest in laundering money. That's why they work together. The moment that one of them perceives that the other is too weak or ineffective or can't help anymore, that's when these bonds will break. I mean, so it's a tricky question. It doesn't mean that they're weak relationships, because opportunistic relationships can be quite strong. But when the situation changes, you could see shifts.
What about Donald Trump? Are we, in a couple of weeks or a few weeks, going to be able to say he is the strongest autocrat, most powerful autocrat in the world?
I think that's not a good word to use, about an elected American president. It is true that he's talked about some American democratic institutions, undermining them. He's nominated people who've also spoken about that. It's possible that he could be the beginning of a decline of American democracy. It's also possible that he will not see himself. In fact, we know he doesn't see himself as the leader of a democratic camp in the sense that most presidents since the Second World War have. But America's a big country. There are a lot of other forces. There's an opposition. There's opposition even within the Republican Party. There are other existing institutions. Let's see what happens. Unfortunately, I do think that the United States will be distracted by this form of internal struggle over the next few years. But we don't yet know who will win.
Let me pull you back here to the situation in Europe, that, of course, being the war in Ukraine and Germany's role in all of this. Germany, as you know, was criticized for dragging its feet to help Ukraine when the Russian invasion began. Now a majority of Germans say that they are against sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and early elections in February could see the Greens, the Green Party, decimated, in part due to that party's hawkish foreign policy, particularly vis-a-vis Ukraine. In the Western liberal order, would you say that Germany is looking like a weak link?
I fear that Germans don't really understand what the consequences of losing the war in Ukraine would be for Germany. And the consequences would be that they would have to spend more money on defense, that they would be in greater danger, that there would be an economic and political and refugee crisis on a scale that no one has imagined yet.
Why do you think that's not being communicated? Why do you think that's not being communicated to them?
It's not for me to say what German politicians should do or should say, but I don't think that the stakes of the war are widely understood. I mean, let's be clear. I mean, it's not that they're not understood. I meet Germans all the time who understand very well what's happening, and who have been rightly proud, actually, of the degree to which Germany did change its policy and it did step up to help Ukraine. And I think people forget how opposed Germany was before the war began to sending any weapons of any kind to Ukraine, and now they've changed. So it's not as if nothing has happened. But I just fear that it's not just Germany, actually. I fear that for most Europeans, what's at stake isn't fully understood. That the choice is not between, we stop the war and then everything goes back to normal. The choice is rather if we lose the war, nothing's normal ever again, or nothing returns to the way it was, and we spend more money on defense and we suffer from greater instability. And I just don't think people have thought that through yet. The wishful thinking about a negotiated deal and the wishful imagination that we're going to fix this fast or there's some instant solution worries me a lot, not just in Germany.
In your book, and you're adamant in your call for the free world to stand up to autocrats, i.e., to defend Ukraine, and to do that, anywhere at any time. I mean, it seems like you're painting a very Hobbesian view of the world, with the free world facing a future with never-ending conflicts or wars. I mean, is there an optimistic view that we are not seeing here, that maybe that we could see? I mean, will this have a happy ending?
I mean, look, Syria should be a shot of optimism for everybody. So there was no regime that seemed more immovable than the Syrian regime, which has been there for half a century. And it appeared to have, no possibility of losing. It appeared to have, ironclad hold over the whole country. It was using horrible violence against its opponents, apparently with impunity. And yet it fell in a matter of days. I mean, hours, really. And I think that shows to everybody who imagines that dictatorships are somehow stronger and more stable. I think that shows how fragile they are. The moment that people sense weakness, the moment they feel that it's over, then it falls apart very fast. And I think that we should remember that when we're dealing with Iran, dealing with Russia, dealing with North Korea, dealing with any of these regimes all over the world.
Let me ask you before we run out of time. In your book, you write that during the civil war, the Syrian regime was trying to tell its people that the country was a prime tourist destination. I mean, not just telling a lie, but making people fear the liar, and it worked. This is a model that's been repeated in many places around the world. It's misinformation. I want to ask you, as a journalist to journalist, how do you see us successfully counteracting this and holding the powerful accountable moving forward?
This is one of the most difficult moments for fact-based or evidence-based journalism that there has ever been. The trust that people once had in different forms of media, rightly or wrongly, has disappeared. It's much more difficult than it used to be to build audience support and trust. Nevertheless, I think that's the only way forward. Journalistic outlets need to understand themselves not purely as businesses, and not purely as organizations with the job of just reporting the news. They need to find a way to build relationships with audiences. They need to think about how to reach audiences, whether through traditional methods or through different forms of social media, not just social media, but other forms of internet contact. I mean, I think a lot of news organizations have done that pretty well and will be able to survive. But understanding that as what has to be the base for their future, this relationship with audiences, building trust. I think that has to be our business model.
I agree. Anne Applebaum, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.